First, I'm Ed Higgins. I'll be moderating today's panel. I want to thank everybody for coming. I think we're really excited to have this panel on science communication and accessibility, communicating science for communities, academia, policy, and everywhere else that we end up communicating what we do as scientists. So to avoid the messy asking everyone to introduce themselves and then no one knows who to start with, I'll just be basically calling on you and then you guys can go in. We have allotted about 5 minutes each, so for all of our amazing panelists here. So first up, we have Raven Baxter, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Raven Baxter, and I am finishing my PhD in a few weeks in science education. And my background is in molecular biology. That's what my bachelor's and master's degrees are in. And I've worn many hats, including my hat as a science communicator. I've also worked as a cancer research scientist in drug discovery and working to find new protocols to research different types of diseases and testing drugs in high throughput robotic systems to find drugs to treat different diseases. And I've also worn hats in higher ed as a lecturer and academic advisor. And now I've turned my sights on building the bridges between science and the public and making sure that we, as scientists, are creating content that really connects with the public in a special way and bridges that gap that exists between science and the public. So I usually do that through creative media. I like to write music. I like to have conversations and just make a really fun and engaging space for people to hear about science. So that's what I'm all about. And I'm really excited to be on the panel with everyone and hear what interesting takes they have on science communication.
Awesome. Thanks, Raven. Up next, we'll hear from Tyus, if you want to go ahead.
Hey everybody, thanks for having me today. And I just want to say thanks to all the moderators and the organizers who have obviously performed so well in putting this all together and their patience. So thank you so much for gathering and bringing us all together to disseminate and talk about a informative discussion of science communication. My name is Tyus Williams. I am a newly incoming student, PhD student at Berkeley, and I'm really excited to be continuing my research on carnivore ecology. My background started at University of Georgia, where I did my undergraduate thesis on jaguars, looking at spatial overlap in the Mountain Pine Ridge Forest Reserve. I would say the most critical component of what I'm interested in studying is understanding how predators not only influence the world around them, but the species that they interact with, and trying to implement more of human dimensions and looking at how we can peacefully and effectively coexist with them and maybe potentially reduce human-wildlife conflict in the future. I think while they are majestic and while they're awe-inspiring, there's a lot that we misunderstand about them, and I hope to unravel a lot of that and then shed that light from a lot of people through education and science communication, and actually show how important they are to a healthy functioning ecosystem. And I hope through my efforts of science communication and sharing my passion with the natural world that a lot of you guys will join me on my journey to learn about the wildlife in the space around you that you occupy. So thanks for everybody being here today. And if you have questions, feel free to ask and I'll do my best to answer them.
Awesome. Thanks, Tyus.
Yeah.
Up next, we'll hear from Dr. Alex Colon Rodriguez. You can go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me here. So I'm Alex. I am a postdoc at the University of California in Davis, where I conduct research in neuroscience focused. Specifically, I try to understand how the amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain, changes in offspring of single parent households. And to do so, I don't use humans, I use pigeons. And so I'm really interested in communicating science, but specifically culturally relevant science. And so to me, I've been doing science communication for the past 11 years. And as a grad student, I developed workshops for K to 12 to teach about science specifically to Hispanic populations. I focused a lot in Puerto Rican populations because that's where I'm from. And I went back to Puerto Rico to teach neuroscience and also to teach how to communicate effectively science. And so here at UC Davis, I had the opportunity to not only do research, but 50% of my time I devoted to science communication faculty training program that I had the opportunity to develop and now I lead. And it's funded by the Moore Foundation. And we have sponsorship from the college dean, so the College of Biological Sciences. And in addition to science communication, I studied as a grad student neuroscience, but also environmental toxicology. And so I'm really interested not only in the culturally relevant component of communicating science, but how important it is to communicate science, specifically that it relates to the environment. And so I hope to, as a professional, move on in my career to continue doing communication, but probably really more focused on the environment and environment interactions with like the nervous system, for example. So if you guys have any questions, just feel free to ask. And I'm honored to be in this amazing panel with people that I admire so much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. Up next, we'll hear from newly minted Dr. Shannon Spear. So if you'd like to go ahead.
Yes, I made a little slide, but thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I am representing, I think, more interactions with the media. It seems like the rest of y'all have a little more focused on social media, which is awesome. It's something I'd love to work more with. But I am a stream biogeochemist and an ecosystem ecologist, and my research focus is really human and climate impacted systems. Right now, pretty much for the duration of my master's and PhD, I've worked in agricultural systems. And so this is where I got a lot of my experience because I communicate a lot with farmers directly. We have really close working relationships with the farmers in the watersheds that we work in. And so we do a lot of communicating our research results with them and tying back, they're super interested to learn, how their practices on the landscape are affecting the water quality. And so that's kind of been the focus. And then I've also had some opportunities to talk with the media about our projects. I'm at Notre Dame, so in Indiana, agriculture, it's all agriculture. The whole state is basically corn or soy. And so there's a lot of investment and interest in the media and in the public about impacts of agriculture on water quality. And so that's kind of where my experience lies. I'm excited though for my next step. I just finished my PhD just a couple weeks ago, and I'm going to be switching to intermittent streams, which is more of a climate focused system. So I'm intrigued to see where my journey will take me with the media and everything there. So that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. Thank you. And then last but not least, we'll be hearing from Callie Chappell.
Hello. I just want to echo everything that everyone has said about just feeling so honored to be in this space with everyone today and being really appreciative to be invited here. So again, my name is Callie Chappell. I am going to talk to you about kind of 3 general areas that I work in education and science policy, and also I'm a professional artist. I grew up in Michigan actually as an adoptee, and I was really curious kind of how there are all these, and I'm sure this resonates with others here, these kind of unseen, unspoken factors that influence how we interact. And so that's really been the focus of my research. So my undergraduate degree and master's degree was in cell and molecular biology from the University of Michigan, but I was really interested in how genetic variation influences how species interact in ecological communities. And so now I'm doing my PhD in ecology and evolution at Stanford University, studying nectar inhabiting microbes. Yeah, there we go. And how genetic variation in microbes influences their interactions within flowers and how that affects plants and pollinators. But the way that I structure this research is not so much like a traditional PhD, but I actually run a lab within a lab of 10 undergraduate students, all from first-gen low-income students of color. And we actually collaboratively work on designing the research questions and conducting the research together as a team, hopefully creating kind of a new model for how PhD students can conduct their research. And in doing that kind of work, it really showed me how important it is to integrate stories and bringing people's full selves to doing research. And so I currently co-run a educational program for students of color from historically under-resourced communities in the Greater Bay Area that works with high school students, mostly young women, starting with storytelling and culture as an entry point for thinking about science, specifically bioengineering and biodesign. And so the idea is that we work with communities, we co-learn with students. We don't teach students, we actually learn with students together on topics they're interested in, and then have them as the kind of voices of authority in their own community, create their own community engagement activities and community teaching activities back home, to kind of be voices of authority in their own culture and communities. But in doing this work, I realized that not only does the work need to be from the bottom up, but also from the top down. So I've done a lot of science policy work. I'm the president of the Sanford Science Policy Group, which is a 250-person organization that does a lot of different science advocacy in Washington, D.C. and in the state of California. I met Ed through a science policy fellowship through the Ecological Society of America, and I'm also a fellow through the American Society of Microbiology. I've also done several fellowships in the area of bioethics, on bioengineering ethics, as well as at the Stanford Law School. But the thing that I'm most passionate about actually is how not only being a scientist, but actually being an artist really works synergistically in communicating science. So I have a fine art practice. I led a student organization at Stanford for many years about science communication through art. I do these sketches of conference proceedings you may have seen on Twitter, to try to democratize who can engage in scientific conversations. And I also have a professional scientific illustration practice. So this was a figure that was published last year in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, for work looking at-risk identities in the field. So I try to integrate all of these things, starting with culture, starting with human connection, as a basis point for thinking about how to communicate and interact with science. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome, thank you. So we have a very wide range of experience that we can tap into today. So I'm pretty excited to get started. One thing I want to note is that we do have closed captioning that's auto-generated through Zoom. So it is not always the best. So if anybody needs it to be updated, we are going to be uploading this, I think, to YouTube, and we'll be using better software to generate the closed captioning. So if there are any issues during the webinar today, just reach out and we'll be able to address that. So now that everybody has introduced themselves, we can open up the Q&A. We have a couple that are in, but if any attendees would like to ask any questions, there's a Q&A box at the bottom and you can type in your question and then we'll work our way through those. So as those are filing in though, we're gonna start with some questions to the panel that were submitted as people registered for the webinar. So up first, we're gonna be talking about, for those looking to get involved in SciComm, do you think there's a greater need for communication at the policy level or at the general public level? These two levels seem to work synergistically. So is the target audience more directed by your personal experience, or should someone be choosing based on where the need is most at those two levels, the public and policy? So I'll open it up. You guys can discuss.
Should I get started?
Sure, yeah.
So I think that the science communication, there's need everywhere, right? There's need in policy and there's need in informing the general public. There's always something that we should be communicating about. And even if there's no need, like a pandemic or like talking about vaccines, which I think we should always talk about, I think that we should always make sure that we communicate the science that we do in a way that they understand its importance, because in the end, they're providing us the necessary money through their tax paying, for us us to be able to do what we do. So we have a responsibility to communicate and do it in a way that everybody can understand what we do and what we do it. But I think that the audience dictates everything that we do, for sure. And I'm not really familiar with journalism, but as a communicator in, K to 12 and very into policy as well, I feel like, of course, we always have to think about the audience, to target the audience, to meet them where they are. And that's the biggest thing also when we're thinking about culturally relevant science communication. If you come and you share analogies that are not this, like my population will not understand, your message is not going to get as far as you think it's going to, and it's not going to have impact. And so I love a book that is called The Master Communicator's Handbook. And it says that science communication, or communication in general, is not about just the content, but it's more about the impact. And so how much impact can you have when you communicate? So I feel like, I think that there's need for both, to answer the question, policy and the general science communication. And I think that the audience is everything. It should always be everything. And in any communication course, they will teach you that the audience is the thing. Like it's the most important thing.
Shannon, did you have something you were going to say?
Yeah, it looks like Kelly and I were battling for the unmute. But I was just going to add too, is that I think that it's kind of a layered approach, because I think if you can effectively communicate with the public, that has the potential to funnel up to the policy level, or even potentially vice versa. And so I think if you have in general a more well-informed public, which is kind of on us as scientists to effectively communicate our work in understandable ways, like Alex was just talking about, I think that that can also be an impetus to push forward policy change as well, because you have people calling their representatives and things like that, that can create a shift in both spheres, I guess. And I think now what we're seeing, especially in the face of the pandemic, is that communicating with the public is also really important, and the misinformation and getting the right information out there is critical and in the right way. So I think it's both ways, but I think you can kind of get that trickle up effect.
And Callie, did you have anything to add to that?
I just wanted to add briefly that it's really hard to say what you should do, but rather the approach I would suggest is reflecting yourself about what am I best suited to do? What am I most excited about? And if you're doing the thing that you're most excited about and that you feel like you have, is your special sauce, like that's going to be the most effective thing that you can do. So just reflecting internally is always, I think, the best place to start any of these conversations.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that's a really great point. Communicating and informing policy and then communicating to the general public, those can be two very different audiences that might be asking different questions and might have different needs, or might respond to different styles of science communication differently. So definitely assess yourself and try to understand where you're best fit, and try out both. There are programs for scientists to get involved in policy, and the general public is right here waiting for you. So definitely give both a shot. Don't be afraid to try both.
So I actually think that's a pretty good transition, because one of the questions also was about transitioning from research to a more broader science communication audience. And so how do you guys advise, PhD students, anybody interested in science, how would you advise them to transition from just that interest in that research into communicating it?
I think I can jump into this. I think the interesting thing, I think it kind of, there's an intersection from the previous question with this one. And if we understand that kind of communication is at the nexus of pretty much like most decision making and how it like influences people like within a surrounding, proximity, we can also understand too that like your interest in how you choose to disseminate that information and how it filters through different frameworks of understanding and knowledge fundamentally also ties into what you see, what you desire to see to fruition, and what you want to see the outcome of your communication. You know, some people want to see change on a political level. Some people want to see change on a behavioral level. Some people want to see just change when it comes to a fundamental perspective of just knowledge and understanding how the world around them operates. And so I think like for PhD students and for graduate students who are in research and who are kind of more in the process of kind of like more gridlock practice of just applying an understanding of knowledge to just completing objectives and research, I feel like you have to ask yourself, okay, like if I were to communicate this to somebody, what would I want their response to be? Would I want it to just be a mere curiosity that's piqued, or I want it to be something like, how can I actually change my behavior to effectively change what I want to see come to reality? And so I think that's really important to like address the question of like really what you desire. I think I was kind of scribbling in my notes. I write a lot of poetry and I do a lot of things, and I wrote down that like I said, intellectualism for the sake of merely knowing is depressing, if not a lonely pursuit by itself. Like applying that knowledge and actually contributing it to society for the well-being of mankind is what actually truly changes the world on a global scale. And so I will leave it there.
It's a good answer. So not just making sure that whoever you're talking to is understanding it, but also that it has the impacts that you want it to have.
Right. I agree. Yeah. I mean, like I could tell people tigers are cool all day, but like I can explain, but I also can explain why. Like tigers are cool, but like, did you know that they basically are ecosystem engineers and they basically change the landscape around them because of top down, like, you know, predation forces. And then that's when they go like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that because of the way they prey on herbivores, that also in turn affects landscape heterogeneity. And they go like, that makes like so much sense why it's so important to like preserve like carnivore species. And like therefore you can pretty much change how people approach, you know, generally problematic or, you know, conflict animals towards the future. So yeah, I think it is. I think it's all about applied knowledge. And I think that's how we start changing the conversation.
So I guess along those lines, this is a question from an attendee. What kinds of new skills have you all had to develop in your pursuit of communicating these kinds of things? Raven, your face kind of lit up. Did you have an answer to this question?
You know, I would say patience, really. And really patience, like patience with yourself, patience with your audience, and just giving yourself a little grace. I think for a lot of people, maybe even including myself, a barrier for me really pursuing my science communication career strongly. At the beginning, it was that I really felt like I maybe didn't know, you know, enough to be a science communicator. Like I felt like science communicators really had to be this, I don't know, ever knowing, like all knowing, ever present, like, you know, person to have this platform and be able to disseminate so much knowledge to the public. Like really feel like you have to be somebody. But honestly, it's not like that at all. You don't have to know everything. Nobody knows everything. I think I've learned how to own that and honestly hold myself accountable for that and be patient with myself. Sometimes I need to spend a little extra time researching something, or maybe I need to spend some time researching someone else to speak about a topic that I think is important, but maybe I don't have the expertise on it, but I think it's important and someone should say something. Or patience with my audience and just making sure that I'm, you know, spending enough time finding even the right words to use to explain my science so that they understand it the way that they should. Just patience overall.
I think
I
that's
guess
great.
I can.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry. So I think that's so good. I think patience is a huge one, and also like just also the understanding that there's space for all of us, and that was a big deal for me because as a minority, the reality is that we don't see a lot of people that look like us doing science communication. So when I started at the beginning, it was like, where are my people at? Like, why aren't there more people that look like me doing the communication or the journalism or all these things, right? And so it felt, it was intimidating for me. And so not because of course representation matters, but also because it's important to see that they can do it. And if they make mistakes, you know, it's like, oh, you see, like, you know, it's part of the process and things like that. And so I feel like it was a big deal, like how to see how the science communication field has been changing, although slowly, but there's more diversity now. And I'm so excited to see that. And I think also I had to learn that words have power, and that, you know, we as scientists or educators and communicators, we have a huge responsibility, and that everything that we say can be taken well or not well. And it's up to us how we respond. And that took me a long time to learn. So I feel like just, you know, like Raven said, you know, just giving myself some grace and understanding that I'm human, and at some point I'm gonna say things that people are not gonna, everybody's not going to be okay with, or the majority of people. And it's okay, it's my opinion how I see things, and as a scientist and a communicator, I can have a different view of how I see that specific topic or thing. And that took me a long time, and I think it takes a lot of you kind of like have to prepare yourself mentally for what's to come, especially if you communicate through social media, because people can be really evil, and like just to shut you down. And you know, and so it is up to us whether you respond or not, because you don't have to. And also whether you change your mind or not, right? And so yeah, so that took me a long time, and I just wanted to share that. Yeah, having a thick skin is a big deal.
I think that's one I could learn a bit more for sure. Did anyone else have anything to add to that too?
I briefly wanted to just touch on it briefly. Raven and Alex did an incredible job, so I don't want to take spotlight. I just wanted to briefly touch on just a topic that I think is really important to this, like new skills that you have to develop when it comes to entering the field of science communication. We talk about patience, we talk about personal grace, we talk about being kind to ourselves, which are so important when it comes to like a field where you feel in tremendous pressure of having to get everything correct on a social platform. But something that I think is really important to me that I often think about too is like not only navigating diverse audiences, which is important, and that's something that's non-negotiable, but the socio-political spheres of like talking into conversations, or actually bringing conversations to people that come from different political backgrounds. And that's something that has been difficult for me at some points in time, and I've had to learn how to figure out how to talk to people that would otherwise disagree with me on almost every point of how like we differ when it comes to moral foundations and socio-political like perspectives, and learning how to be able to come at a different angle and go like, okay, like this person was raised in a particular type of environment or culture or like region of the world where like they weren't taught these things, or either they were taught to like disagree with these things or have a dissenting opinion. And how can I reach them in a way where I'm not attacking them fundamentally on like a person, or like and implying that there is a moral character flaw on them, but like trying to relay information in a way where it's like, here's how we both benefit from this, regardless of the fact that like we might look different from each other, or we might like vote differently from each other. And so I think something that like is really important for science communicators too is to also learn how to navigate like political spheres as well, like because there's still an entire half of the country that votes differently from many others, and it's like we have to still include those people in the conversations if we're ever going to effectively progress as a society together. So it's going to be tough. It sucks when somebody's like climate change isn't real, and it's like, and you want to just like go off. And that's been me. I'm that guy. I'm the first to like jump out of the chair, like but like I have to really pull myself in. I'm like okay, like this person has been lied to. How can I change this? And how can I enlighten them in a way where I'm not insulting them, but I'm trying to bring them into the conversation and show them like, hey, I care about your well-being and welfare just like everybody else. So yeah, it's tough, but it's something that we need to address.
All right, I think, yeah, very thorough answer. And I think definitely one of the harder things for me as well is communicating across the aisle. I think it's not very easy. Callie, I don't know what your experience is specifically talking with policymakers and everyone, but have you had to communicate to policymakers that maybe are on a different side of yours on science? I guess it's not worth it to say our side versus their side, but have you had to communicate your science to people that may not have bought into it as easily?
Yes, but not in a political sense as well. So I live in the state of California now, which I'll just say that. But growing up, I grew up in a small town in Michigan. I was like the only person of color. My parents are white because I'm adopted. And I was constantly having to navigate those conversations of having a very different lived experience and having lived experiences that conflicted with kind of the political dogma of the people that I was around. And so coming at those from like, I really disagree with like my family, but I love them. And I really resonated with what Tyrus was saying, like, that what Tyus was saying was about like coming at it from a place, if you can, and totally recognizing that like people have deep trauma associated with deep, serious injustice that's happened in this country and in the world. But if you can come from a place of trying to find grace, that oftentimes has been more effective. But of course, emphasizing that taking care of yourself personally in those spaces is the most important thing.
Right. And so also Shannon, as I also do stream ecology. And so I know that when you're talking to stakeholders, and especially in rural America and rural farmers, they can also be a very different audience to communicate to. So do you have any advice on how to navigate that?
Yes, that has definitely been an interesting thing. We fortunately haven't, been like shouted off people's land. That did happen to me when I was in Arkansas. And yeah, that was a very scary experience. But anyway, but I think that for me in communicating to the farmers, the most important thing is to remember that they're businessmen at the end of the day, or women at the end of the day. And so they care about the bottom line. And it's not that they don't care about the environment, because many of them do. And that's why farmers are often called the stewards of the environment, even though their practices often have negative impacts. But they are trying to earn a livelihood and feed their families, which is obviously going to be something that's very close to their hearts. And so a lot of what we try to do is communicate things back to them in terms of the benefits to them. And so, you try this conservation practice on your land. Well, you should get X, Y, and Z benefit, because we also do a lot of soil work as well. And so we're looking at the soils on their land. So this practice benefits your soil. You're getting more organic matter, which means that your fields are worth more money. So that's good for you, or your yields are higher, which is great. But you also are benefiting downstream communities because you have, your less nutrients are leaving your land and getting into the water. And so trying to tie it back to kind of the dual benefits, I think is important, at least in the context of farming and environmental impacts, because they do care about the environment, but they also care about their livelihoods, and they need to be keeping their yields up and things like that. So I think remembering the balance and trying to tie it back into benefits to that person, whoever you're speaking with, can be really important. I think that can also tie to climate change as well, where people may not believe it in the broad sense of the word, but they see in their town, in their specific thing, like, oh, we used to have 10 feet of snow every winter, and now they don't see that. So like, they see the impacts of it, but they may not connect it to the larger sphere of climate change or global warming, or however they've been taught to think about this. And so if you can kind of get more personal and on a personal level with people, I think that that's a really effective mechanism for creating change on a broader scale, or shifting people's opinions and things like that.
Ed, can I add one point? So I've had experience on policy where I've gone to Capitol Hill 2 times as a grad student and now as a postdoc, and talking to people that are, from different party from the one that I identify or like kind of go with, is when you do biomedical research, I found that it's not difficult to communicate with them. But the thing is, you have 2 minutes to kind of like share with them why what you're doing is important and why they should communicate, continue supporting it. And so I feel if as a biomedical researcher, it is easier our position than, climate or environmental things where it's just like really harder. And so I think that as a biomedical researcher, it was surprisingly really nice, how receptive they are of knowing what we're doing. Of course, personal things, religion, and all these things influence people's views. And so if you have a family member like I am in neuroscience that has like a brain disorder, they're going to be more invested into understanding. But I think that in general, my experience is that both the parties are really interested in the research and biomedical stuff in general. So it's not as difficult to communicate with policymakers, in my experience, than to communicate other topics like environmental stuff, for sure. Yeah.
Sounds like a repeating kind of advice that I'm hearing, at least, is the need to make the science applicable to your audience, which I think is a very important skill, and it's also a very difficult one. And while also protecting yourself and making sure that you don't get too invested in the outcomes that you may be getting. And so that kind of leads me to one of the more fun questions. What are some of the more common mistakes you've seen well-intentioned science communicators making? Because we all want to do good, but I can definitely see sometimes that there are some gaps that you make along the way. So what do you guys think about those kind of common mistakes that people make?
I can hop in here really quickly. I think the biggest one is just not respecting the person you're talking to. Like a lot of scientists like feel like I've got all this knowledge, I've studied this for so long, but like everyone has their own important different forms of knowledge, and that needs to be respected. And engaging with people as peers and equals is a really important ethic to bring to communicating with anyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like one thing I've noticed with like science communication is just like, I think it's sometimes it's kind of like the adverse reaction that people have to like when their knowledge is challenged, especially if they kind of like see themselves as like a champion of like their subject, and like people have the ability to ask questions or like offer refutations and like offer rebuttals, and that's natural discourse in throughout the history and eons of human society. And so for me it's like there's this idea where they think that like almost it's not even just that their ideas are being challenged, but like the entirety of like their character is being like challenged. And then there's immediately this defense mechanism, like this gut knee-jerk reaction where it's like they have to throw in like all of their credentials in like Ivory League, like credibilities and accolades, and it's like it just comes across very elitist. And I think the thing that we don't want to do in science is like impose like intellectual elitism when anybody should be able to like go into science and anybody can perform science, and not going to an Ivy League school doesn't make you a better scientist than somebody who doesn't. And it's like doing that to the public for people who are already intimidated and view scientists as like the giants or like purveyors of knowledge can be extremely disconcerting and can be harmful to like trying to implement or at least establish like long-term fruitful conversations that go in towards the future. So I just think it's really important. We got to be careful where it's like somebody asks the question and it's like, I'm a PhD student at like Harvard, like where have you done? And it's like that's like what you don't want to do. It's like calling somebody dumb is the last thing that you want to do because you immediately shut down your audience. So I just think we need to just be more approachable. And I think it's like, and it's hard to do that. And my other thing is like, we really need to work. You said it good with good intentions. We all have fancy words and we love to use them. But I would say the jargon is my number one thing. Is like we got to do better about that. Like it's like I could talk about spatial dynamics and metabolic requirements influencing like carnivore movement patterns over a landscape like all day. But like right there, I just said that. Like most people are gonna be like, what the hell did this guy just like say? Like, So it's like rather than just saying, yeah, animals eat a certain amount of food or certain, have certain diet requirements in order to expend certain amounts of energy. Like that's it. Like I just cut that in half. And so just like being approachable, using commonplace language, cut out the jargon, you make a lot of people more happy in your sphere. So that's it.
I agree with everything that's been said. And I have to say that the biggest mistake as scientists and sometimes as communicators that we can make is assuming that people know already some of the things that you're covering. And so like Taya said, we cannot, if you really want to have an impact and teach people about, the COVID-19 and things like this, you cannot assume that they understand how the virus, how we get infected and how, it ends up like damaging lungs or the heart or whatever. Like we have to be able to, if whatever topic you're communicating, we have to just make it in a way that not only we tell a story, but you take them by the hand and you walk them through up until the point you want to make, so that you make sure that they understand. And so I think that, of course, audience is everything, but I think that we should also, kind of put in the extra effort in making sure that what you're putting out there is like in a way that is structured in a way that it could reach anybody. And I think that that way we could have a bigger impact. I think also another thing that I feel like some scientists feel like just because you're a scientist, you're going to be a good communicator. And that's a huge mistake. I've worked really hard to craft, on my craft, to polish myself, to understand communication, to understand how to be more inclusive, because it's a huge mistake we make in not being inclusive and not, and just these are things that we have to, it's like everything, we just need to learn and read about it, and then we are able to apply it so much better. But making the assumption that just because we do science and we're involved in science, we're going to be good communicators is something that I've seen people assume, and they do very, very bad, especially during this pandemic. It's been like exponentially grow, like it's grown so much where everybody feels like they have something to say. And if my expertise is sure biology, but I haven't practiced my communicating skills, it doesn't, you probably won't do a good job, right? And so you just have to put in the extra effort to polish what you're gonna get out, and so that you make sure that it's not confusing or misleading or whatever it is. That's what I have to say.
I think following on that too is don't bury the lead. Like I think that's the one of the biggest issues that people have when trying to communicate with the general public, is that they bury the lead and they think of communication in their science framework, which is kind of like a funnel. If you think about it, you're going from this big background, honing into what your specific issue is, and then talking about your results. But when you're communicating with the public, it's really the opposite, where you have your point at the top, where you want to get to the bottom line and then tell them, so what? Why does this matter? Why is it relevant to you? And then you provide the supporting details. And so I think that is where people get into like a tricky situation where they just bury the lead, and then people are snoozing off and miss like the big point, and kind of the take home. So if you start with that, with your big punchline, then I think that is all that really helps, is remembering it's more like a pyramid versus a funnel, like we would do in a scientific paper, is important.
Yeah, and I know I've gotten that advice a number of times, but it's not easy to put into practice, I have to say. And even removing jargon can be a bit difficult. Do you guys have tips on how to actually refine those skills? One of the questions that we got in advance was, how do you have academic conversations without sounding too academic? And I know that's what we've been touching on, but do you guys have tips on how to actually go about doing so?
I think one of the things that I've always been taught is to try and tell a story, and tell a story where you can provide connections to people's lives and create analogies or metaphors that may make sense to them. And again, this goes back to also gearing it towards what your specific audience is as well. But the more you can make it like a story and kind of weave together your points in that way, I think it's a lot easier for people to understand. And I also think that practicing, like I think people take practicing for granted. And like, seriously, like what I did to, practice, like for talking to the media, is I mean, it was like a workshop, but they filmed us in a pretend like TV interview. And I would recommend just doing that by yourself. And then you can hear yourself back and be like, okay, well, these words that I said, yeah, they're relevant in my field, but that's not going to translate. And you can kind of check yourself and refine yourself, or practice for your mom or your husband or wife or your partner or whoever. Like, practice to someone who's not like in it like you are, and then see if they get stuck up on different things. I think can be a really helpful way to also kind of refine and get the jargon out, because I know that is definitely a struggle.
So Raven, I know you're mostly in an educational setting. Do you also find practicing as if you're in front of your students? Like, do you find that's a good way to go about it? How are you refining those skills?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, and I don't really think about it that often, but I've taught in classrooms from kindergarten to college seniors. And my teaching approach is honestly the same between all those grade levels, and even with the public. I pretty much just treat it all the same. I think as an educator, I like to assess prior knowledge first for my audience and like the students in my classroom. And it kind of depends on from person to person, like how you operate on your platform. But for me, I'm very conversational. I like to have a lot of conversations. So I might ask the people following me, I'm mainly on social media, I'm like, well, what do you guys know about, I don't know, Alzheimer's disease? Like, I know this person recently was diagnosed and it was publicly noted in the media. So like, what do you guys know about it? And does this impact you all? And some people were like, yeah, actually it does. I have somebody in my family who I'm taking care of, or my brother was diagnosed, or I was diagnosed with this, or I've heard about it. And then I'm like, okay. But then a lot of people are like, well, yeah, I don't really know much about it. So then I know in my next communication piece, I really do need to do a very ground level explanation of what's going on. And I would probably do it almost the same way I do it with a kindergartner. Even just from me understanding or having worked in classrooms where 12th graders didn't know that um, a female uterus wasn't connected to our stomach. I've worked in classrooms where that was their prior knowledge. I've asked students draw the reproductive system, and they would connect the uterus to a stomach and include all of that together, and they were in 12th grade. And that was normal at the school I was in. So you have to realize some people are graduating with that level of scientific knowledge, and that's no blame on them, but like, you really do have to meet people where they are. And I would just love to see more people willing to go to that basic level, instead of flaunting all of this flowery scientific knowledge. Like, let's meet people where they are.
So I think that's great. I think you bring up a lot of good points. And you mentioned that you've taught K through 12 basically and beyond. And I think the rest of our panelists here have experience teaching at those levels. And so a question we have from an attendee, Heather, asks, so she says that one of the largest challenges facing the scientific community is public K-12 education. And I think, it's not very unified across the country and everything. And so Heather says, speaking with a public high school science teacher is enough to convince anyone of how kind of confused our nation's unified approach is to education in general. And she was wondering if you guys have any thoughts on this and how, she was lucky to have PBS and Bill Nye and have those sort of like nationwide things. So what do you guys think about that?
I think a lot of things.
Pretty broad, right?
Yes, I think there's so many things to think. Where do you even start? I mean, I could make a bulleted point list. I think our educators need to be compensated more for the work that they're doing, because the reality is we have teachers who are doing way more than just teaching. They're tackling students fighting, they're disciplining, they're talking to parents, they're grading papers, they're taking on some people have to work 2 or 3 extra jobs, waiting tables at restaurants, driving Uber just to get by. And it really puts a strain on teacher performance. For some people, it can be very stressful. And that's just one dimension of it, right? Compensating our teachers for the important work that they're doing, it's so important, is definitely a step in the right direction. But I also think that the way that we build our curriculums isn't quite building the skills that we need for people to really properly assess, like critically think about scientific information. I think there definitely needs to be a better emphasis on that and just a restructuring overall of the curriculums, but that's no easy task. There's so much work to be done. It's really hard to answer that question concisely, but I totally agree with the question and questioning what can we do better for our students so that we are graduating people who can who are more prepared for our scientific society.
This one is hard because I agree with everything Raven said, but also I always studied in public schools in Puerto Rico. And the difference between my education and my friends in the private Catholic school was huge. And so I think that they should definitely focus on the curriculum, and it's hard, but also making sure that there are no differences if I'm poor or I'm rich in the type of education that I can get. This education should be the same for all, right? And we should all have the opportunity to be able to learn as much as our peers in the fancy schools or private schools get to learn. And so it was really, not only we come into college with the disadvantage that we were not exposed to the things that our peers in private schools, and I'm talking about Puerto Rico in my experience, come in with, but we always also like come with this like negative thought of like, we feel kind of like less than because we know this. Like I was told by my own teachers that, this is all we can do. Like we cannot really do experiments in our class, or like, this is the book that we use, and like, we don't provide the other book because it's too expensive. This is the one we're going to stick with. And so they're honest with us as educators. And I guess that's a good thing, but it's also bad because it starts to build in our mind that, wow, like just because my mom, my family couldn't, pay for me to go to a private school, like, why is it's very unfair. And so I think that nobody should feel like they're not getting the most out of their education or the best education because of where they come from or their financial, and so, or the region where they live. Like I have friends where like, they lived in, in regions in Georgia, for example, that like 2 towns down, they got an amazing education, but this group was like kicked to the side. And so, yeah, there has to be, the structuring has to change, but it should be even in all the schools. Like education should be similar in whether you study in Massachusetts or in Santurce, Puerto Rico. Like you should be able to have the same quality education, and that's the biggest deal for me. There's so much, of course, that should be done, but in providing the resources to the teachers so that they can do so. And that was the biggest deal in public education. Like if you don't provide those resources, there's not much they can do in addition to what they're doing. It's really hard. Yep.
Can I add one quick thing that's a little bit outside the scope of K-12 public education, but I just want to highlight the importance of informal learning spaces as well. Not all education happens in the classroom, and just to empower scientists who might be on the call today who see these massive structural problems with American education and aren't necessarily in the position to reform next generation science standards, et cetera, but are able to create free education programs, radical education programs, political education programs in their own communities in informal spaces, and work in community gardens, we work in public libraries, right? There are lots of spaces that scientists can create informal learning opportunities that can supplement other existing educational inequalities, and also have conversations within their own spaces about what scientific knowledge is, right? Like scientific knowledge is lived experience. Scientific knowledge is cultural knowledge. And that dogma within the scientific community of not acknowledging that is something that we also can do that kind of fundamentally shapes or could change the way that scientific discourse is engaged in the public.
And I think bringing up informal learning spaces is a really good point. What other sort of avenues and platforms and like methods of science communication do you guys use? I guess, what are your favorites? This was a question that was asked ahead of time. Do you feel any are particular more effective at communicating science? I know that we're all pretty active on Twitter. I know I at least didn't understand how much science actually is discussed on Twitter, but do you guys have other ones?
Just very briefly, I think this is the Midwesterner in me. Talking to people in line at the grocery store is my favorite venue for science communication, or like on the Greyhound bus, on public transit, waiting for public transit. I like find myself just chatting with strangers, and then they're like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I'm like, "Wow, let's talk about that. What do you do first?"
I love that. Like I would love to see you like strike up a conversation just randomly at the bus stop, like, hey, did you know about CRISPR? And like just start talking to people about gene editing and just making science a normal conversation. I absolutely love that idea. I'm gonna try that out and report back.
I just wanted to jump in because I share that with Callie. I'm the same way. I do that. I'll just like find a way to like weave the conversations in like wherever I can, and like I'll be literally at like a grocery store and I'm literally checking out the aisle and he's like, oh, like, what do you got going on today? And I was like, oh, you know, I was like doing like some research today. Or so then he's like, oh, like, what do you do? And like, and I was like, oh, I'm an ecologist. I'm like a research ecologist. Like I said, a wildlife ecology. And he was like, what? He was like, get out of here. And the cool thing was that like the guy, and the reason why I remember is because it was such a positive, like reassurance and affirmation. And the guy who was the guy who was checking me out, the guy was Black. And so like, I was, and obviously I'm a man of color as well. And I'm Black. And he was like, and you're Black? And I was like, yeah. He was like, oh, he was like, hell, he's like, I've never met another Black wildlife ecologist in my life. He was like, go ahead. He was like, that's awesome. And I was like, that's dope, man. And he was like, dude, he was like, that's so awesome. He was like, you're literally like a Black Jeff Corwin. He's like the first one I've ever met in my entire life. And I was like, I am so proud and honored to be the first. Like, and he was like, that is so cool. He's like, I didn't even know we could do that. And I was like, we can do that. And so it's just like, you never know who you will inspire. You never know like the curiosity that you like will pique. And I found the more that I do it, like people are really interested in hearing what you have to say. I used to think like scientists were like so normal when I was growing up as a kid, but I realized that like we're kind of like rare. Like I don't meet a lot of fellow biologists just like in random public spaces, like bumping into people. Like, and it's really funny actually how uncommon it is, because people are either like, you're the first I've ever met that does this, or like, I didn't even know that you guys do these things. So yeah, trying to weave them in as casual everyday conversations is great, because I don't know, I feel like if you could talk about like surface level everyday conversations about like what's on the TV, you should be able to talk about like what's going on with recent science engineering. So it's like, that's how I feel. I mean, like if they're talking about on PBS, we should be able to talk about it in real life. So
I wanted to add, one of the most rewarding conversations I've had have been with the janitors at the buildings where I work, because people, my dad worked in maintenance and all his life, and so people don't even interact with these people, and so I just make an effort to say, good evening, how are you doing? It's great to see you. And so I always make an effort to ask them, so do you know what we do here? And so they can kind of ask, they would tell like, oh, well, you work with pigeons, because there's pigeon pictures everywhere. And so, but they'll be like, I have no idea. And so to tell them, to share basic things that we do. So we study the brain of pigeons, and they are so excited and so happy that we take the time to share with them what we do, that to me, that's like the most rewarding, to work, like to talk with the janitors, or like the people that come and check the electrical things in the lab, or just like anybody that comes to the space specifically, because of course they know we do science, but they don't really know. And I think that is really rewarding to see how happy they are that we take the time. And to me, that has been like, I talk to people in Target, sure, but I haven't done it like Cali or Ty is, like they're going hard. I do it like really randomly, but but at my space, like at work, for example, I've done it a lot actually. And I wanted to add one last thing, is that I use this thing called the Upgoer 5 text editor. If you guys want to practice how to say how you do in the most common words used ever, you should use the Upgoer 5, and you'll see how difficult it is to share what you do in the most basic words. Like it took me a long time to be able to polish a one sentence research in this app. I recommend it to everybody.
And I think it's called Upgoer 5 because it's about explaining how rockets work, or that was the original idea behind it. And so like rocket and rocket ship isn't one of the most common words. And so it's an upgoer, which I thought was really interesting.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, right?
That's hilarious.
It's crazy. And it's really difficult too. And I see, Raven, you've got your mask on, and that actually is a perfect transition, because another question that we've had is, how do we think science communication has changed in the face of COVID? I mean, we're not necessarily having these conversations with our peers at the grocery shop or at the grocery store if we're 6 feet away, right? So how do we see science communication moving forward?
I have learned the power of social media. I have learned that using the platforms that we have available to communicate science works, that there are different target audiences. So like I realized that the audience in Facebook is very different than my people on Twitter, or that the people on Instagram. And so I feel like, to me, that was like, I didn't understand it well enough. And now there are articles out and things, but I didn't understand how much people use social media and the power that it has. So we can utilize it for sure to communicate science, and we can reach so many people. And like, of course, in Twitter, there's an article that says that the number of followers, correlates with the amount of impact that you have, but I don't have a ton of followers. And so I feel like I've also been able to communicate things and reach people. And so I feel like, the pandemic has allowed me to reach people that I wouldn't have otherwise. I've been able to go to meetings like in Hawaii, for example, and through virtually, that I wouldn't have been able to ensure the science and the importance of communicating science. So I feel like understanding that we have these tools available, that they are free, that we can have an impact, that there's like so many things that we can use to polish our craft available and free, and like it's a great way to realize how much we can do to help others. And I think that that's what the pandemic just taught me. Yeah.
I briefly wanted to chip in and say, just because I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be a scientist under the pandemic. And I feel like, especially under this pandemic where public health is so needed, especially when it comes to science literacy, more than ever than we've seen when it comes to understanding how diseases and understanding the dynamics of epidemiology, just understanding how a population can be affected by a virus or any sort of like an outbreak, and how we have a inherent responsibility morally onto each other to act accordingly and responsibly to reduce the spread. There's a lot of pressure when from the eyes of the public on science figures to behave accordingly, to act appropriately, and to also to convey and disseminate the information that's necessary on a accurate level, to a point where it's like we have the spotlight that we've always wanted, and it's like, and now there's kind of like a bit of like a pressure to do it right. But I also think it's interesting because since the pandemic, I've also noticed simultaneously, like there is a lot of distrust as well with, with the pandemic, and people don't understand how viruses work. And like we have scientists that are telling people like this is how this works, like wear a mask, like even though you get vaccinated, there's a 2-week hiatus period before your immune system fully like processes like the virus. So you can still get infected even after you've gotten like the vaccine. And like there's just like there's this, there's this kind of like delineation where people like don't quite seem to understand like what we're trying to tell them and like how this in fact benefits them, but also the fact that we're trying to give as much clarity as possible for them to understand all the information that's accessible. And I think it's frustrating for people because I think people just want to be told like what they want, what they need to do, but it's not that simple. And so that's frustrating for a lot because like we have to give you like the full scope of like what's happening here. We can't just say, get vaccinated and like wear a mask. Like there's reasons why, like here's the step and the approach. And so I feel like a lot of people, especially in the public health field, and I really admire everything that they're doing because they have a lot on them right now, but they're trying to do their best and basically explain like, we know that this sucks for everybody, but like, there's a reason why we're trying to emphasize this is so important. And I think it goes back down to the point originally in this conversation that it's like, this is why science literacy, and this is why conversations around like, science and public health and these topics are so important because, politics infused with it can obviously, conflate and cause different narratives. So yeah, and that's why these things can get really sometimes just, caustic and corrosive for many.
I think the pandemic has really highlighted, I think going along with what Tyus has said, is the importance of being clear and concise, but explaining everything. Because I think today there's been this valuation of people who push back against the experts and don't take take our word for it when we're the ones who've been researching this our whole life or whatever. And people are like, well, I need to do my own research and like prove that this, and then the people who prove it wrong become these like figureheads of like, oh, well, they're going against the grain and this is so novel and whatever. And so I think that this is a battle that as scientists we're coming upon with the pandemic and may face more in the future. And I think we've seen it with climate change as well, is that people don't trust experts for some reason, but we need them to listen to us. And it creates this like weird cycle. And I'm not sure what the easy solution or way to solve this is. But I think that's part of yes, exactly. The pseudo intellectuals. I think that's the problem that we're kind of up against today. And there's a glut of information. Anybody can post anything on the internet and claim they're an expert, and then they're often not. And it creates a very weird dynamic, and people don't know what to believe, or they start to believe the wrong things or whatever because they've been fed incorrect information. And I think people have hard time filtering out what is and isn't reliable or good information. And so I think that also goes back to the educational issues, is that teaching people critical scientific thinking early on is very important, and how to think independently and critically to come to their own conclusions. Granted, there's going to be people who come to the same conclusions that we're at now, but it may be less, I guess.
I think everybody made amazing points, and I just want to add like a thought. And that is like, I think that we could do a better job of building community around science enough so that people will listen to us even when things change, because that is a part of science. The trial and error process can sometimes be very public, and that can affect people's trust, because on the outside it appears that we're flip-flopping when the reality is we're asking more and more questions and we get more and more data, and that changes our conclusions sometimes. Or maybe our conclusion is getting enriched and we have more data, but it kind of has a different meaning now that we know more things. And that can make people say, well, but you said this yesterday and now you're saying this. And it's like, yes, we were researching the same thing, but we asked two different questions, and now we have two different pieces of data and like, now this is what we know and that's just what it is. But when you haven't spent time to build community around your platform that you're communicating science from, people are like, well, who are you? Like, why should we trust you? We don't even know you and your flip-floppy self. Like, why should we hang around and listen to what you have to say? And that's why I feel like we do need to build more community. It's so important that, to me personally, it's just as important that science communicators talk about things that are maybe not even about science, but just about themselves, about what they care about, their community, what is their connection to the public, so that people understand, like, we have real life human beings with families and things they care about who's doing this research. And like, when things change, it's not because we have bad intentions. It's literally, we're just doing our jobs. We're just regular people doing our jobs, people who care about the same things that you care about. And we just have new data to report. So that's just one thing I wanted to add.
I would also add briefly that like there are legitimate reasons why certain communities have a distrust in science. There's a socio-political historical context for science skepticism. And I think we as science practitioners have an obligation to explicitly address that, right? Talk about how the harms that we as a community have caused on certain communities and why there are ramifications for that today, and address that with reparations in various ways, right? So like, I just wanted to throw that out there, that it's not like, oh, they're like these dumb people who just don't appreciate science. It's like, no. There's like a long historical and today reason why that exists, and we need to tangle with that explicitly, I think, as a community.
And communicate that within our own community as well, it sounds like. Because I don't think that's as widespread of a concept as we would like it to be. But I want to be mindful of time. It's 2:20, so I think that if anybody wants to kind of go through some last thoughts that we've covered a really wide range of topics. So if you each would like to you can sum up what you said before, or just kind of address overall what you think would be a good take-home message. But I think now would be the time to give out some last thoughts. And this is going to take a second, so don't be worried about awkward silence as we all consider what is important to revisit.
I wanted to say,
sorry.
Do you want to go, Raven? Please, by all means, go first.
Okay, yeah, I'll be brief. We talked about a lot today, but I really do want to emphasize that being a science communicator has been so rewarding for me as a person. I really love building community around science, and I've made some amazing connections with people that I maybe would have never had the opportunity to speak to had I not chosen to be a science communicator and focus on community building and community engagement. And yes, there are a lot of things that we worry about as science communicators, but I think that it's that attention to practice that makes everybody on this panel great at what they do, which is why they're here today. And there are programs and organizations to support you. I don't know all of them offhand, but if you wanted to get actual training in SciComm, like, you could go to an organization like the Allen Alda Center for Science Communication. There might be something on your campus that is available for you to participate in. There's so many different ways to get involved, but definitely don't hesitate. There's no wrong way. Well, there is a wrong way, but I would say don't just trust your gut. If you really want to get into SciComm, just give it a shot. And I think you'll find your natural fit, and hopefully it will be just as rewarding for you as it is for us.
I just wanted to briefly point out, it was kind of the conversation that we had it was a thought that I think is really important for me, because I've been thinking a lot about it like these past couple of years. Science, is liberating in itself to be able to like understand how the world works. And I think it's a gift to be able to like try to share that passion with others and be able to show people like, here's how, the universe functions, and here's how it operates, and here are all the systematics and processes of like how it works, like simultaneously threaded together. And like, that's brilliant. And like creating an inclusive and diverse audience, and like bringing those people together, and kind of like weaving it all in one so we can all work together collaboratively is non-negotiable, and it's not, it's, you know, and it's not an option. But there's also something that I wanted to point out too. It's like, I've also noticed, like, with this pandemic and like what we're seeing around with the discourse of like public health and science communication, is the long-term effect of basically like science contrarianism that's been allowed to occur for pretty much, I feel like, the last 10 years, especially since the emergence of the terminology of like global warming, when, you know, Al Gore was talking about it, which was great for him, but it's a lot for a lot of political contention. And I wanted to say, as a science community, and for a lot of, you know, of the individuals in this audience who are listening, who are watching, who are kind of pursuing their careers, we have a inherent responsibility to dismantle and dethrone the individuals that perform that action of like pseudo intellectualism and science contrarianism. It's really scary, and I give these as examples because I use this as a guest lecture. Alexandra knows what I'm talking about. When you look at people like Jordan Peterson, you look at people like Ben Shapiro, who have a platform where they can spew all sorts of violent and dangerous jargon and language, and then layer it with fancy lexicon and vernacular because they come from an academic background, is something that we really have to tackle. And it's like, and it's really scary because these people have a platform that they have the ability to say all of these obscene and egregious statements and package it in a nice box that makes it sound like what they're saying is mild and, like, you know, not inflammatory. And I think we, as a responsibility, as like actual educators and purveyors of information that stand on a good ethical moral understanding of like how we approach these things, we have to do our part and like challenge people's ideas of these things. Like, I have friends who listen to like Jordan Peterson. I talk to them like, why do you think he's a good source of information? Like, why do you think he's a good source of information? Why do you like listening to him? And they're like, and if they can't give you a good reason, like, maybe you should actually start looking towards actual academics who do this for a living on an expert level, rather than listening to somebody who merely talks on a podcast that got a PhD at a brief point in their life and did this for, you know, a short period of time. And so I just wanted to make that piece and just say that on my soapbox, because it's just really scary, the damage that they're doing, especially to a lot of young individuals on social media. Like, there's so many young kids who just go on YouTube and watch these guys go on rants, and they take it as fact. And they're like, oh, these guys sound really smart, so it has to be true. And it's not. And sometimes it's a self-serving endeavor and motive that they're trying to fulfill. Yeah. And so I just wanted to say that because I just think it's really important. We have to talk about the damaging effects of contrarianism and the pseudo intellectualism now.
I think that all the points made are amazing. I have to agree with Raven and Tyus. I feel like, in addition to all the things that I've said, I feel like we have to, even, you know, not everybody needs to have a PhD or a master's or a college degree to question, right? And so just because somebody has a PhD or a degree in general and is a science communicator doesn't mean that, you know, we need to trust, sure, but you also can question things, right? And so the point that Ty has made is like, you sure, like, some of these people are you know, like, you know, they have like PhD degrees, but it doesn't mean that what they say, and because they camouflage it with fancy words, it is what it is. Question and do your own research and look at the things also yourself, and you will find who is worth following and trusting. And if the community is already targeting them and have flagged them as, you know, people that provide misinformation, like, I think that that's a good sign, right? The community, the science communication community is pretty large in social media, and that's a really good indicator when they say, you know, watch out from this person. It's a pretty good indicator. Do your own research and you'll find that maybe that's not the right person to be taking facts from, and following them, right? Because then you're going to continue to spread that false information, and that's the problem, right? And so I had to have this conversation with my mom too, because my mom my mom takes like information not only from Facebook, but like, for example, magazines and things like that. And it's important that we do our own work and we just Google things, right? And so I'm not judging my mother. I love her dearly, but it's just, you know, some populations are more, the way they receive information is very different than us. And so I feel like we need to be good stewards and just try to like help them understand that, you know, we will help you, we try to help you, but also you have to be curious, do your own homework, and make sure that before sharing what you're sharing, like, you know, vitamin and tea will help you clear this COVID. please do your research, right? Don't be spreading that. And so that was a big deal during this pandemic. And yeah, and like Raven said, just take the chance and, you know, just try it out. And I think communicating science is really powerful. It has allowed me also to not only meet but work with people that I never thought I would be able to. And so I feel like there's space for all of us. So just, yes, just give it a try.
Yeah, I think just to add something on top of obviously these really important but serious points is that also to have fun with it. I think science communication is so fun and it's so rewarding. And I think some of the most fun that I've had is working with especially younger kids. Not that communicating my research to the farmers isn't fun, but I love seeing their eyes light up when they we do like dye tracer releases in streams. So we pour in this bright pink dye to look at how the water flows, and they love that. They go nuts. And it's just so fun to see them get excited about it. And I think by participating in SciComm, I think it also kind of can sustains and reinvigorates your love for your own work and can kind of help you. You know, everybody goes through kind of dips and gets in ruts sometimes. And I think this is an awesome avenue to get excited and just keep enjoying it and kind of reconnect to your purpose through it. And so I think that that's what SciComm has been for me outside of just, you know, talking to farmers or something like that, but it's been a way to sustain my passion, which has been really great.
And I'll just close with asking people to reflect on why they're doing science, right? Like, what are you excited about, right? Like, why are you doing this? What is the value that you're creating through your work? And are you going to let others, are you going to absolve yourself of the responsibility and the obligation to communicate why you love doing what you do to other people? Like, I really think that science communications, like we have a moral or ethical obligation as science practitioners to communicate what we do because we know why we're doing it, right? We're thinking about that. We're excited about it. And so who better to communicate that than ourselves, right? And that first step is really scary because you probably spent a lot of time becoming an expert in something, maybe studying it for a long time. And now you're being asked to become a total novice and do something that you've never tried out before. You're probably going to fail a lot. And that's really scary. But just know that you want to think about the legacy you want to leave behind through your work, right? How do you want people to remember what you've created in your degree, in your progression as a science practitioner? And how will you take responsibility and how will you take on agency over what you leave behind? And I think a really efficacious way of doing that is through science communication. So go forth and make the change you want to see in the world.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists. Your time is extremely valuable. And I'm so happy that we've had a chance to hear your thoughts on science communication and sort of teach us all how to be better science communicators. So I will make sure that the link back to our website is available. And so that has everybody's social media on it. And so we will make sure that this recording is available. And once again, thank you so much. This has been a really awesome panel.
Thank you for having us.